colonisation of Australia represented a huge territorial gain for the Empire. But the colonisation of Australia presented an array of problems to do with the peopling of the continent. There was the treatment of the country's indigenous people, the arrival of new settlers, the question of how British people would adapt to the new land, the meanings of masculinity and femininity in the building of the nation, and the relations between the frontier and life in the suburbs. All these problems to do with the colonisation of Australia also shaped the imperial relationship. They preoccupied Australians in the first half of the 20th century in particular, a time when character and physique were seen as driving forces in the destiny of races, nations, and individuals.
A start in the 100 metres, and it's a good start too.
Even into the 1950s, the issues raised by white settlement were often understood as problems concerning the physical attributes of Australians. Intense anxiety was expressed over physical deficiencies. Intense pride was taken in Australians' bodily prowess.
Although British trade and commerce had been preeminent around the world in the first half of the 19th century, it certainly wasn't in the second half. And by the end of the 19th century, you have serious trade and commercial rivals like the Germans and the Americans. And you have a lot of talk about the decline of the British race. You have a lot of worries about... I think it's partly to do with the way that evolutionary theory gets intellectualised by what we now call sociologists, I suppose, people who are interested in applying that sort of thinking to the way society's going. And evolutionary theory becomes very much concerned with society, and I think its defining category is not so much the individual, the animal, the species, the human in this case, but in fact the society or the nation. And so that the survival of the fittest is very much, that notion is very much defined in terms of one nation versus another, rather than one individual versus another. And so you do have this interest in the way, at least in terms of how the empire's going, given that Britain is not going too well on the trade and commerce front. You do have this interest in the way the colonies are evolving. And it's a particular interest that does again focus on bodies, this theme. It focuses on the way the Australian male is evolving. And again, it's a focus on focus on the bush, and it's tied up with notions of the way that particular colonial environment just might bring about an Australian character, a flag bearer for empire masculinity, if you like, who's going to do better than the British. And that is reflected in the First World War. I mean, it's really interesting the way all these comparisons are made in the First World War about the physical superiority of the Australians. And I think probably other post-colonial societies too, like the Canadians and the South Africans, probably similar things were said. But certainly the Australians took up the idea and ran with it.
At its most formal, the British Empire entered Australia elaborately dressed for its colonising enterprise. The sovereign's image was pervasive. And there was an imperial bearing about the Queen's representatives in Australia, men with an air of command. Pomp and ceremony was an important element of imperial display. There were enough bristling moustaches and enough show of cold steel to reinforce the point that the British Empire controlled more of the world's surface and ruled a greater number of people than any empire before it. It was an empire of baubles, bangles, and bright shiny things, in the form of honours awarded for service to the empire and worn on ceremonial occasions. In the hierarchy of race, the British placed themselves at the top. In 1900, most white Australians were proud members of the British race and enthusiastic supporters of the empire at large. British customs and practice were the norm by which others were judged. Other races were to varying degrees exotic and inferior. The federal government's first legislative act in 1901 was the passage of the Immigration Restriction Act. better known as the White Australia policy. The control and regulation of bodies was a paramount concern of this legislation. The Act was based on the assumption of a world divided naturally on racial lines, and the belief that the races did not mix. In 1919, Australia's Prime Minister Billy Hughes told Federal Parliament that the White Australia policy was the centrepiece of Australian democracy.
This is the foundation of all that Australia has fought for. This is the only part of the empire or of the world where there is so little admixture of races. We are more British than Britain, and we hold firmly to this great principle of a white Australia because we know what we know, and because we have liberty, and we believe in our race and in ourselves and in our capacity to achieve our great destiny.
The exclusion of Aboriginal people from Australian life was taken for granted as natural. White Australians had little doubt that the Aboriginal population was subject to inevitable extinction. Early settlers had believed that an apparently declining Aboriginal population was the result of divine judgment. Popular writers thought it was Darwin's natural selection at work.
And very soon, the cries of little possum took on a new significance.
White children of the 1920s were told that, despite the persistence of remote communities, they never were at all numerous for such a large country, and were scattered very thinly over it. It is sad, but this strange race is vanishing away. The assumption that Australia was essentially empty, and that its indigenous inhabitants had not made productive use of the land, was seen as the rationale for British sovereignty over the continent. It was a popular prejudice, reflected in, among other things, the paintings of the time.
We see Aboriginal people being constructed through various forms of the ethnographic vision and through the orientalising vision of the 19th century. But by about 1890, for some reason, the depiction of Aboriginal people seems to fall off. And I think what's happening here is that Aboriginal people are starting to be lost as part of the Australian psyche. It isn't until the 1930s when the communist painters like Noel Counihan, Yossel Bergner, Danilya Vassiliev start painting Aboriginal people in urban Melbourne that we start to see black people appearing in any number again in our pictures.
Readers of a 1945 Australian picture book learnt that Australian Aborigines wear no clothes, build no dwellings, nor till the soil. Depending for their existence upon what nature provides, they make no effort to produce in a material way, but live on anything edible which can be gathered or caught. Despite the fact that, in the name of protection, Aboriginal people were subject to extraordinarily oppressive regimes of personal control and supervision, they were represented as primeval beings, too readily dependent on nature. Aboriginal bodies were photographed in ways which emphasised how exotic white Australians imagined them to be in their natural surroundings, with the other inhabitants of what was proudly called a strange land. They were also the subject of demeaning comedy. One instance is the figure of Mulga Fred, later Palaco Bill, used to advertise business shirts for decades. Mulga Fred was a versatile symbol for authentic Australianness and corporate pride.
Australia today takes her place among the nations. From the economic aspect, she ranks as the world's greatest wool grower and one of the outstanding primary producer countries. We are building a great industrial civilization on this primary basis and developing a new race, a new force in the culture of mind and body. In this sunny land, sport builds a racial physique equal to any in the world, and our golden beaches have taught mankind new ways to play. Australian history already bears the blazonry of glory won by our volunteers on the battlefields of the Great War.
Some bodies were also icons. Generations of Australian school children grew up with certain pictures, images reminding them of empire, and others saying things about the character and history of the nation.
From the early 1920s, the big pictures produced in the 1890s, the big icons of Australian art, like Shearing the Rams, which was painted by Roberts in 1890, became very popular. In this picture, the Australian body is constructed through three main types, if you like, through the young boy, who is located in the far left of the composition, he's the rouseabout, through to the strong shearer, the young shearer in the foreground, who we see shearing a ram, through to the far right of the composition, the older overseer. In this picture, like so many others painted by Heidelberg School painters during the 1890s, we understand the Australian to be a man. We understand the Australian to be Anglo-Celtic.
And school children themselves embodied Australian aspirations. When the 150th anniversary of white colonisation was celebrated in 1938, the festivities in Sydney included a pageant by 2,000 domestic science schoolgirls.
In a series of beautiful tableaux, the children portray the cycles of life of a wheat field, fresh and fruitful as the life of the young nation, depicting the growth and harvesting.
The girls formed an effective image of what Australians wanted to see, a healthy export economy feeding imperial demand. But looking at bodies in this way raises further questions about the types of body best suited to the colonising enterprise. Governors and their gorgeous attire were all very well, but how effective would they be in the practical tasks of colonisation? The colonists, who had to do physical work for a living, soon emerged as a counterpoint to the rarefied beings who had no need to dirty themselves with hard labour. Physical work itself acquired honourable meanings, and hard, lean, sun-tanned bodies were contrasted with the fleshy white bodies of those other agents of empire, the capitalists. The honest toil of the pioneers took on epic proportions in Charles Chauvel's 1948 classic, Sons of Matthew, where families like the O'Riordans were shown to have built the nation and the empire. If nationhood was to be won with the spilling of Australian blood on the empire's battlefields, the nation's prosperity would result from copious expenditure of that other noble body fluid, sweat. The sufferings and lasting achievements of pioneering families like the O'Riordans made them the conventional heroes of colonisation. Pioneering was a struggle against nature. It was physical work, and it was to be found in the bush on, it was said, the edges of civilization. And the edges of civilization might create better bodies than civilization itself. Founding editor of the Lone Hand magazine, Frank Fox, considered the backcountry Australian good building stuff in a time when the tendency is rather towards an anemic type of civilization. The belief that Australians should resist the debilitating encroachments of modern civilization was born out of the cultural predicament of a new Commonwealth, sparsely populated, startled by Japan's sudden rise to world power, and convinced that racial purity was the key to national cohesion. Charles Chauvel highlighted these anxieties well in his 1946 film, The Overlanders.
In 1942, the Japanese were driving invincibly southward from Singapore. It seemed inevitable that next into their hands would fall the northern territory of Australia, largest undeveloped region in the world, with 1 million head of cattle and a population of only 5,000 whites.
Hey, how's the war going? They left them at Milne Bay. They turned them at Kokoda. Wait till we get there. Good on you, mate. Good on you, digger.
The type of Australian who could best defend the fragile Commonwealth while resisting the softening attractions of urban civilization was bound to attract favourable notice. There was all the more reason to enshrine a robust Australian character when it became evident that cities accounted for a disconcertingly large proportion of the population. There was always a danger that the splendid few would have to rescue the comfortable majority, snugly housed in the suburbs. For here dwelt another Australian, unequal to the demands of nationhood. Whereas the robust Australian was showered with praise, the inferior Australian was harshly treated. There were several ways of achieving inferiority, but one of the surest was to live in a suburb.
One of the statements that was regularly made about Australians was that they were adventurers, that they come from adventurous stock, and that somehow the British had lost the plot on adventure. And in the 20th century, they'd become a rather dull, suburban, unadventurous and timid people, whereas 20th century Australians had retained some of that spirit of adventure which was associated with pre-industrial England, associated with Elizabethan England. If you accept the idea that Australians had a special aptitude for adventure, there was still within the Australian framework particular threats or apprehensions about how to maintain the spirit of adventure through the 20th century. And certainly one of the concerns in Australia was that this was a particularly urban society. Australians were very conscious of the degree of urbanisation in the late 19th century. And they're also very conscious of the fact that urbanisation, so it was argued, so it was said, diminished moral capacity, diminished physical strength, and diminished those adventurous qualities that these pre-industrial types were said to have possessed in full measure. So the suburb emerges as the antithesis of what Australia should all be about, and the suburb becomes confining, limiting. It becomes the statement about, or a symbol of a world that's predictable and dull, unadventurous, and a betrayal of that great Elizabethan inheritance that Australians had allegedly made part of themselves. You know, that was their statement to the world.
As early as 1904, a royal commission into the decline of the birth rate in New South Wales had concluded that Australians were soft and pleasure-loving. Mental and bodily discipline was lacking. But Australian people wanted better bodies. They wanted firm bodies. They needed to believe that in physique and character, Australians had the qualities necessary to survive and prosper.
The adventurous spirit was very much couched in terms of virile manhood. Virile manhood keeps recurring through this period as an ideal of what a new nation should be aspiring to. And virile manhood clearly is a very gender-bound term. So it presents all sorts of problems, I think, for the negotiation of Australian womanhood. What are Australian women in a society that values virile manhood in quite these terms?
There are very few pictures in which women play a very significant role. And one of the dominant roles, social roles, which we see women acting out in pictures is, of course, that of the mother. Strangely, we have very few pictures like John Longstaff's The Young Mother, painted in Paris in 1891, in which motherhood is represented within a positive emotional atmosphere, one in which we can see the power which motherhood bestows on women. Much more often, we see motherhood depicted as a distressful condition, and Abby Altson's Flood Sufferings is a typical example of this. Here we see a young mother lying prone on a stretcher with a young baby at her breast. She's being evacuated by two strapping specimens of Australian manhood. What this picture, I suppose, is about more than motherhood, it's about masculinity. The masculine bodies are the ones that dominate the picture plane. They are seen large, strong, active, while the body of the woman is small, passive, frail. So once again, even in pictures which are about maternity, we see the body of men playing a very large part in the composition of the pictures. In this picture, what is almost being suggested is that maternity is a situation which requires regulation by men. It is a condition for women in which men need to intervene in order that women can be mothers.
The future of your children is the future of your country, and in your hands lies their health and happiness. Their needs are simple, but you must not fail them. Give them their birthright, their just heritage. Give them health.
The federal government had embarked upon an experiment of breeding a new people in a new land, and in doing so, hoped that the best qualities of the sturdy British pioneers would be preserved. In fact, given the right conditions, Australians might become healthier and more spirited than those stay-at-home Britons. Matters of population and settlement figured prominently in public debate. The slogan of the pro-development group, the Boosters, was Australia Unlimited. For them, the future lay in closer settlement of rural areas and the exploitation of the remote north. Some experts disagreed and used their new positions of authority to influence policy. Griffith Taylor was Australia's first professor of geography and a determined critic of the Boosters. Taylor believed that most of Australia was too arid to support large numbers of people. Moreover, he doubted the capacity of Europeans to work efficiently in tropical environments and emphasized the hardships of life in remote Australia against romantic notions of pioneering. Taylor's ideas did not break with racial thinking. What made them disturbing to many was his suggestion that the order of racial superiority was not as clear-cut as most white Australians believed. In the last quarter of the 19th century, and well into the 20th, the racial fitness of the Australian was repeatedly tested and measured. It was not always verified, but Australian governments never gave up on Australian bodies. They could always be improved.
All right now.
They could be made healthier if, for example, home life was modernized along the lines governments suggested. If people understood their own bodies better and accepted the civic importance and domestic virtue of hygiene, sanitation, nutrition, and temperance. The physical well-being of the Australian population seemed an achievable goal and was part of that great destiny Prime Minister Hughes had imagined. The Immigration Restriction Bill had protected Australians, as they saw it, from racial contamination and from the grinding poverty which arose from unregulated working conditions. Politicians boasted that Australians were better fed, better housed, and better clothed than any population elsewhere. One enthusiast looked forward to Australia becoming a paradise of physical perfection, a notion supported at the highest level of the empire when, in 1933, the Duke of Gloucester was treated to Sydney's most manly display.
The Duke described one standard-bearer as the finest specimen of bronzed manhood he had ever seen, and surf life-saving officials were kept busy answering his eager questions.
Colonising Australia meant filling it up with white Australians, lots of them. But anxiety and speculation continued. Were white Australian bodies up to the job? The British race, it was thought, had evolved over time. Was Australia's population pure? Was it growing fast enough?
We need large numbers of people because to the north of us there are even larger numbers, but we don't want large numbers that are going to dilute or weaken our racial stock. So there's this real dilemma about how you resolve that particular contradiction. But the decline of the birth rate issue is again part of that wider discussion of how virile a young nation should be, and if it is virile, won't it be producing large families?
the Royal Commission into the Decline of the Birth Rate was extremely interesting because it focused very much on women actually taking control over their own fertility. So they asked all sorts of interesting questions to chemists about what sort of things were they selling to women. Were women coming in and actually asking for these things unblushingly over the counter? But the debates that were there really centred on why women might be having fewer children, and the centre of the argument was an economic one. Were families unable to afford more children? And overwhelmingly working class families told the Commission that yes, they couldn't afford to have more children. And it was certainly women who'd already had 3, 4 children who stopped having the 5th, 6th or 7th one that a generation or so before they would have had. And so there was a very big change taking place at that point. And I think in the early years of the 1900s then, once it became clear that nothing was going to change, that all the government incentives and debate about the declining moral fibre of the nation with people using contraception and so on wasn't going to affect them actually doing it, instead attention turned to remedial measures, to actually fostering welfare services and various other services to look after babies.
Baby health centres appeared in cities and towns, in working class and middle class suburbs, and with them a new group of professional experts. By the late 1930s, over 200 centres operated in Victoria alone, weighing and measuring and monitoring over 50,000 babies.
And the health and the future of these sturdy young Australians is one of the greatest concerns of the men who govern the nation today. Baby health centers.
The message of the infant welfare movement was routine and discipline. Traditional practices were frowned upon. A knowledge of mothercraft was no longer something women were assumed to naturally possess. Instead, motherhood became a matter for specialized technique and carefully interpreted information. And in all these things, mothers had to be trained. Australians may have become suburban, but their welfare was still seen to depend upon a fit, growing, white population. The regulation of bodies, combined with the training of minds, was the new road to national efficiency.
Plenty of play and plenty of work, and plenty of opportunity too, lie before these sturdy youngsters of a sun-drenched land. As the young country grows, theirs is the task ahead. They are the people who will build tomorrow's Australia.
Thousands and thousands of pigeons set free, the Olympic Games are open, and peace shall reign.
In 1956, Melbourne hosted the Olympic Games. By then, the British Empire had become the Commonwealth, and Britain's political and economic role in Australian life was greatly diminished. Australians still prided themselves on their physical qualities, though the language of the 20s and 30s, those references to virility, racial vigour and fine specimens of manhood, were beginning to sound dated and inappropriate by the late 1950s. There was more to completed nationhood than the production of bronzed, sun-drenched lifesavers with pectorals capable of dazzling a duke. And in any event, the Australia of the 1950s was clearly a nation of rapidly expanding suburbs, fueled by substantial post-war immigration. The proper management of bodies was still as important as ever, but belief in Australia as a racially uniform paradise of physical perfection had started to fade. Even so, the belief that Australians are better at producing athletic bodies than agile minds still persists, even today.